Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the fourth session of our summer lecture series on global challenges confronting the United States. I'd like to make a couple housekeeping announcements first. First, I'd like to, again, welcome our colleagues at the OSHER at University of Vermont who are seeing this live streaming. And as you heard in the announcement, please silence your cell phones. Once again, during the break, please bring your questions down to the front on the cards, and we will sort them during the break. We also have audio CDs and DVDs of every one of the 7 sessions, and you can purchase them at the back. They're $15 for DVDs and $10 for the CDs. You also saw on the screen announcement about the upcoming movie. It is not next Tuesday. It is on Tuesday the 15th, but we gave you an extra week to alert you to that. I'd now like to thank our underwriters and sponsors, the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, Caldwell Law, Kendall at Hanover, Ledyard Bank, Wells Fargo Advisors, and this session's sponsor, Mascoma Bank. So at this point, I would like to introduce our session moderator, Tom Blinkhorn, who will introduce our speaker. Tom?
Thank you, Pete. I have a special delight in introducing this only woman on the program this summer. And the special delight is that she is one royal trooper. At midnight, last night, we did not know whether she would make it. There were tremendous thunderstorms that were in New England, covering Boston and Manchester. Her flight was supposed to leave Reagan at 4:30. It didn't leave for 5 hours. She stayed in the airport. I tried to convince her to maybe we ought to do a Skype, or Pete and I could tell some war stories and Brexit jokes, maybe get Bruce and McDonald involved. But, you know, the idea of doing this for 2 hours was a bit daunting. So, you know, we're back and forth. Lisa is communicating with the driver. I'm communicating with Lisa. Lisa's communicating with Julie. And then I get, I was at dinner, and at midnight, I get a message, I'm on my way. She arrived at 12:30. She got up early this morning. And when you see her, you will realize how this woman could have worked 16 hours every day when she was in the government. She's an extraordinary woman, and I'm very happy to be able to introduce her. She is a native of a suburb of Detroit, and she spent her early years there and got interested in Europe in high school. Went to Xavier University in Cincinnati, has scholarships at the Sorbonne and in Germany, and took a great interest in things, transatlantic policies, and realized, even though she was thinking about becoming a journalist at one point, that she really wanted to get on the inside. So she went to American University to get her graduate degree, and then got into the government. First of all, her life has been in public service for the government as well as nonprofits. She did a lot of work on security, national security and defense, and then ended up with a job in the Defense Department under Mr. Gates and Panetta. She worked closely with the two secretaries. And then she found her way into the Vice President's office, where she served as Deputy National Security Advisor to Joe Biden on a range of issues that will be very, very germane and instructive here today. Right now, she is Director of Transatlantic Security Programs and a Senior Fellow at the Center for a New American Security. This is an independent, bipartisan, nonprofit in Washington, D.C. Julie Smith is married to David Black, who also works in the government in the USAID. They have 2 small children, and in Chevy Chase, they're known as the Blacksmiths. I want to bring her out now and tell you that we're in for a royal treat. And I tell you, as Joe Biden, her former boss, would say, this woman tells the facts and there's no malarkey. Julie. Great. You want some water?
I'm good, thanks. Well, good morning. Wow, what a turnout. You can see I was anxious to leave Washington, so anxious that I was willing to spend 6 hours in Washington Reagan yesterday. But it's such a pleasure to be here and such a treat to get outside of the swamp, literally and figuratively. After the election, I came to realize that one of the things that I had failed to do in recent years was really to get outside of Washington. And I think if there's one thing that we learned from last fall's election, it's the importance of doing things like this, connecting with Americans in different parts of the country, hearing different insights and perspectives, and testing some of our ideas instead of just operating in a bubble and assuming that everybody's rowing in the same direction and trusting us to do the right thing. And so it's just a real treat to get outside of DC, and I'm looking forward most of all to hearing your questions and engaging a bit in a conversation afterwards. But before we do that, I want to spend a little time this morning talking about Europe, and I will talk about Europe, and I will talk about Brexit. But I really want to widen the aperture a little bit and talk about the future of the West, and specifically the transatlantic relationship, Europe, the United States, what we're able to do together, what we're currently doing together, what we're not doing together, and focus a little bit on that subject for the next, 45 minutes to an hour. And then we can talk about really whatever's on your mind, and it doesn't have to be limited to the transatlantic relationship. We can jump into all sorts of stuff. So let me start. Tom noted that I've spent a lot of my career focusing on Europe and the transatlantic relationship. And I wanted to tell you about a little anecdote that I find amusing now looking back. So I left the White House in 2013, the summer of 2013, and I came out. And I thought what I would do is I would go back to what I had been doing before I went into government in 2009. And that is to work at a think tank on transatlantic relations and on Europe. And that sounded perfectly suitable to me and something that I wanted to do. Before I did that, I made a tour around Washington, D.C. I met with a number of my mentors, people that I respect a great deal, some people that I had worked with in government that were now out. And I asked them, what do you think about this idea? I'm coming out of government service, and I think I should go back and do what I was doing before. And it was interesting. Everybody that I met with at that time had the same response. Remember, this is in the summer of 2013. And they said to me, why would you do that? There's nothing going on in Europe. And it's so sleepy, Julie, and the only thing that you could possibly do on the transatlantic relationship or on Europe, there's this little thing in the headlines, not even in the headlines, it was on page, 824 of the Washington Post, something called TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. And that's the only thing, Julie, that you would end up working on, and doesn't that sound sleepy and boring? And you should do something else. You should think about another subject to sink your teeth in. You worked on Syria at the White House. There are all sorts of global challenges. So I was really taken aback by that, and I actually decided to listen very carefully to their advice, and I ended up joining CNAS not to work on Europe and transatlantic security issues, but actually on a broad project on grand strategy, which I really enjoyed. But if I look back now and I think about those conversations, I mean, I almost can't process the word sleepy when it comes to describing what's happening in the transatlantic relationship and what's happening in Europe right now. I think what's happened just over the last few years is we've seen some tectonic shifts in the transatlantic relationship, really on both sides of the Atlantic, that are going to have lasting implications for the future of the transatlantic relationship, for the future of global stability, for the future of America's role in the world, and we should be paying attention to those issues and watching them quite closely and working to improve the current state of affairs. So with that in mind, this is why I want to talk to you today about the West. The West can mean a lot of things and includes our allies in faraway places like Australia and Japan. But when I say the West this morning, I want to bring that in a little bit. I want to talk about primarily the transatlantic part of that and the transatlantic relationship, what's happening in Europe, what's happening in the United States, and why am I, as a good Europeanist, deeply worried about what's out on the horizon right now, because I don't think it's sleepy at all, and we've got work to do. So let's do a little tour here, and before I go to Europe, I'm going to start with Europe and walk you through a couple of the things that are going on, and we will talk about Brexit. But I want to step back just for a minute and set the table for you a little bit. And when I say set the table, I mean I just want to talk for a minute about what type of geostrategic environment do we, the United States and Europe, find ourselves in at the moment. Today's security environment has no precedent, in my mind. No single challenge to U.S. interests is equivalent to those posed by Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, or the Soviet Union during the 20th century. But I do believe that the sheer volume and complexity of the threats that we face today and their interrelationship are at least as daunting. Europe and the United States face a very complicated and interconnected web of global and regional challenges. And I'm going to describe two characteristics of that global system right now that represent what's changed just in the last couple of years. So the first thing I want to talk about from a broad geostrategic perspective is the growing diversity of actors that Europe and the United States now face. Of course, we all know that during the Cold War, the primary actor that we were grappling with, or actors, were states. And at the end of the Cold War, that changed. We went from focusing primarily on the Soviet Union to then an array of transnational threats, things like weapons of mass destruction, failed states, ethnic conflict, the list goes on and on. We moved into 9/11 and the post-9/11 environment. Then Europe and the United States were focused like a laser on non-state actors, Al-Qaeda in particular. Now today, we still face all of those challenges. We face transnational threats, global pandemics, climate change. We face non-state actors, not just Al-Qaeda, but now the Islamic State. But we have had, in addition to that, the return of great power politics. We now have China and Russia reasserting themselves in the global stage and actively undermining the rules-based order in ways I think we never imagined. And it's not just China and Russia returning or striving or moving towards an aspiration of great power status and posing some challenges in that regard, but it's countries like India and Indonesia, whose middle class is going to triple in the next 15 years, making Indonesia the 7th or possibly 8th largest economy in the world by 2030. Now, some of these countries that I'm talking about aren't going to threaten the United States or Europe directly, but many of them are working very actively to revise regional or global security structures and orders. And their behavior is at risk of triggering miscalculations that could easily spark broader conflicts in their neighborhoods and beyond. And let's not forget that second tier is still out there of what we once referred to as rogue states. I like to call them regional adversaries. Countries like Iran, North Korea are in the headlines now almost daily. And these are countries that often do consider the United States and or Europe to be the enemy. They are threatening the non-proliferation regimes that we've worked so hard to establish. They support terrorism and often engage in human rights violations. So ultimately, what I want to say with the first characteristic that I'm outlining for you is that ultimately the United States and Europe are trying to play three-dimensional chess. We're trying to cope with the return of great power politics. We're trying to cope with transnational threats. We're trying to cope with non-state actors, all at different levels, requiring different levels of engagement, different policies, different tools, some of which we haven't even developed yet. The second characteristic that I wanted to lay out in terms of the broad geostrategic environment that we find ourselves in is the use of asymmetric tactics that we're seeing on behalf of many of our adversaries around the world. Many of the groups and states that I just mentioned, whether it's the great powers or non-state actors or those regional adversaries, are increasingly relying on a group of asymmetric tactics and capabilities. Not conventional forces, some of them are. Russia has dramatically modernized its military forces in recent years. But I'm not talking about tanks and jets and troops. I'm talking about things like energy coercion or cyber attacks or anti-access aerial denial, A2AD capabilities. Many of you might be familiar with that. Capabilities that are designed to deny the United States and its allies access to certain theaters. Strategic communications tactics or disinformation campaigns that we've seen the Russians in particular, but not just the Russians, many countries using with great skill and with great frequency. A lot of these countries are also taking advantage of technological advances to get their hands on new technologies that allow them to complicate our power projection efforts or weaken our own technological superiority or explore weaknesses in our conventional capabilities. And just to cite one example, drones is a good example in this case. There was a time when just the number of countries that had drones could be counted on one hand. We now have a situation where 90 countries around the world have drones, 20 of them have armed drones, and 20 more are actively working to develop drones. We've also seen instances where the Islamic State is relying on commercially developed drones to use them in battle. So that's just one case where technology and the proliferation of technology and the advancement of technology has come to be particularly useful for some of our adversaries. And that is posing enormous challenges for age-old institutions and government structures that were designed for an entirely different era. So the two pillars I just wanted to lay out, again, are the three-dimensional chess that we're all trying to play, addressing this wide range of actors, and then the tactics that our adversaries are using, again, ultimately trying to challenge and creating real problems for the tools that we developed decades ago. Those tools aren't necessarily adequate or well-equipped to deal with cyber hacking or disinformation or energy coercion. Okay, so the fundamental question this morning then is, how are Europe and the United States positioned to deal with today's global security environment, to cope with what I just laid out for you? And in a word, poorly. Europe and the United States are increasingly distracted by a range of internal crises that are inhibiting their ability to both act and lead. And I want to go through some of those internal crises or challenges, including a few external ones, and talk about kind of what's at play on both sides of the Atlantic. So let's start on the other side of the Atlantic first with Europe. Let me start, there's a long list. I'm sure we could make a long list of the things that Europe's currently grappling with. But the first one I would mention is migration. What Europe has experienced in the last 2 years is a migration crisis on a scale that we have not seen since World War II. And it surged, you'll remember seeing about it and reading about it frequently in 2015, where we literally had each and every day thousands of refugees pouring into Europe, primarily from the Middle East and conflicts there, Syria most notably, but also places like Afghanistan, coming from Africa and beyond. Now, thanks to an agreement that the European Union brokered with Turkey, they've been able to ebb the flow a little bit of those coming from Syria, primarily the route through Turkey into Greece. They've been able to relocate some of the refugees coming into Greece, returning them to Turkey, putting them in a queue to then bring them to Europe. That agreement, miraculously, given the tensions in the Turkish-EU relationship right now, is holding. And so you're not reading about this crisis as much as you once did. But I'm here to tell you that the route through the central Mediterranean is definitely increasing and becoming more attractive to refugees, particularly from Africa, but even from the Middle East, people finding their way to Libya that then go up into Italy. To give you an idea, so far this year alone, now we're just in August, early August, Italy has had 90,000 refugees show up on its shores. And think about, again, a scale for a country like Italy to absorb those refugees. And so the question right now is, how will this migration crisis continue to impact or have an impact on Europe's political scene, its political processes, the political polarization that we're seeing across the continent, and how can it develop better policies to relocate some of these refugees and not allow the migration crisis to completely rip open the European project. This crisis has led to a tremendous amount of polarization across the European continent, and it's weakening passport-free travel. And it has started to lead to a complete political realignment across the continent as countries like Poland and Hungary have said, we will not take a single refugee, we will relocate no one. And a country like Germany that has basically had an open door policy along with Sweden, Denmark, and others. And how do you manage that kind of friction and tension among member states that should have a common policy towards migration, but instead are moving towards national policies of migration, and again, splitting up European unity at a time when we need it most. So that's one thing that's happening on the European continent, and it has led to another. It has ultimately fueled the wave of populist sentiment that has the populist winds that have been blowing across the European continent now for years on end. We've seen the rise of right-wing parties. We've seen some of them start to develop stronger presence in national parliaments across Europe. And the catalysts for these populist movements really are ultimately two things. One is the migration crisis. But the other one is the 2008 financial crisis, where, like here, we have found a lot of grievances by publics complaining about income disparities, disaffection with globalization, and worries, serious worries about unemployment, jobs, immigration, healthcare, the list goes on. And so this wave of movements across Europe is starting, again, to divide countries and create trends that are very troubling. I would just note Poland, for example, now has a government that essentially ran on an anti-EU and anti-immigrant platform. And that government is starting to roll back some of the democratic reforms that were put in place after the end of the Cold War. And so you don't have a hard exit of a country like Poland or Hungary. It's what I call a soft exit, where some of these countries are starting to distance themselves from the core values of the European project and drift away from a unified sense of values and norms that serve as the foundation of that project. And then, yes, we have the hard exit, and that brings us to Brexit. Cameron promised a referendum on membership in the EU, thinking maybe he could avoid actually doing that. But in the end, he had to deliver. He held the referendum, as you all know, last summer. And tragically, in my mind, a slight majority of people voted to leave the European Union. Now we're faced with a situation where, never having done this before, Brussels and London are completely consumed with this process that is going to be going on for the better part of the next 2 years, probably longer. If they don't have a deal at the end of this process, the UK will just be moved out of the European Union without any soft landing, any idea of how the trade relationship is going to work, how they're going to have free movement of people across Europe into the United Kingdom. And right now, there isn't a deal that the UK Parliament could get through. The Prime Minister Theresa May is incredibly weakened. She called a snap election and decided that that would be a way to strengthen her mandate so she could move rapidly with Brexit and have a hard exit and get on with it and make Britain stronger in her mind. I'm very skeptical about that. But nonetheless, ended up weakening herself because the election didn't quite play out as expected. And now she finds herself in the very awkward position of having to extend a hand to Labour and trying to see if she can build some sort of consensus for a post-Brexit Britain, whatever that may look like. But I think slowly it's seeping in that the UK lacks a number of things, most notably the skill sets, the manufacturing base, and the productivity to really succeed without the European Union. And there are open-ended questions about whether or not the UK will end up exiting the European Union a stronger member of the international community or a weaker member, and that remains to be seen. What we know, though, is that Europe has been weakened by this event, by this process. Our strongest and most capable partner in Europe is incredibly distracted and consumed by this process. There are no easy answers, there are no easy fixes, and it is taking up the energy of most of the people working in the British government. Simultaneously, Brussels, the European Union, is also consumed. And so I think when I look out on the horizon and I think about that three-dimensional chessboard and I think about all the asymmetric tactics for which we need to be better prepared, I look at Europe and I can't find the leading lights that are going to help us address some of these challenges. Personally, I hope Merkel will get through the election and serve as a stronger partner to the United States, but I worry about what we're going to see going forward in terms of a capable and willing to act European partner on the other side of the Atlantic. Let me mention just one other thing about what's happening in Europe right now. Simultaneously, while Europe is grappling with the recovery from the 2008 financial crisis, grappling with the migration crisis, grappling with the waves of populist movements across the European continent, and coping with Brexit, Russia is off on stage right here doing its very best to undermine European unity, to divide Europe from within and divide Europe from the United States. And again, it's relying on an array of tactics for which we are unprepared. So NATO, for example, isn't exactly sure what tools it has in its toolkit to deal with energy coercion or a cyber attack, as was the case in Estonia in 2008, or disinformation campaigns. So NATO kind of shrugs its shoulder. We know what to do if Russia rolls tanks across the border into Latvia. We've got that. We know we'll declare Article 5 and hopefully we'll respond militarily. But when Russia buzzes a ship or turns the transponder off on a jet and comes perilously close to a commercial flight, or uses a disinformation campaign to undermine the candidacy of Emmanuel Macron in the French election, we're not sure what to do about it. Neither national governments nor institutions like the European Union or NATO really are equipped to deal with these types of challenges. So Russia is able to do all sorts of things right now, quite effectively, to seize on this moment in Europe's history where it is divided already and distracted and go in and see if it can create further instability through an array of tactics. Okay, so that's Europe. We could also talk about the terrorist attacks in Europe, by the way. There have been countless terrorist attacks over the last 2 years, whether it's Paris, Brussels, Nice, Berlin, or the multiple attacks we've seen in London. And that, too, has created a tremendous amount of insecurity and fear, concerns about ISIL's ability to not only inspire attacks in Europe, but direct them or undertake them on behalf of the Islamic State. So there's a lot going on in Europe. That's Europe. What's going on over here? So we, nothing at all. Everything's running perfectly fine over here. Smooth sailing, well-oiled machine. We've got our act together. So we had an election. I think we all know that now. We know that Russia actively worked to undermine the outcome of that election and interfere in the outcome of the election. And we're still getting to the bottom of all the details of that, but we know with certainty that Russia did try to interfere in our election. We also know that we ended up with a candidate that aligns quite nicely with some of those populist sentiments that we see on the other side of the Atlantic. So some of the grievances, the disaffection with globalization, worries about income disparities, worried about the future of their kids. Will my kids have a better life than I have had? Those questions that are being asked on the other side of the Atlantic about immigration, about healthcare, about national government's ability to meet the requirements and needs of everyday citizens are the same questions in many ways that are being asked here. And we now have had the end result of that. We've elected someone that campaigned on the Make America Great Again, retrenchment, pull-in, isolationism, let's focus on challenges at home, distance ourselves, disengage from the world, and has, at best, kind of an uncertain view about the value of the transatlantic relationship in the broader global security environment. At worst, has a negative view of the European Union, of NATO, and has no strategy for Russia whatsoever, and in some ways, at least the president, will not even acknowledge what Russia did in our election last fall. And so we, too, are facing some of the same challenges that Europe's facing, but find ourselves, like London, like Brussels, distracted and consumed with our own hyper-partisanship and chaos as the government refuses to settle in. We've had multiple political appointees that have not settled in their seats, a government that's kind of functioning at half capacity, and a city, my city, completely consumed with the chaos in the White House and not looking up too often and looking out at North Korea and Iran and Russia and all the rest. And it's a problem. And on top of it, The broader trend in the United States that I would mention that has really nothing to do with our current president or what happened in our election last fall, but something that Obama has had to grapple with over the years and will continue to haunt future US presidents. And that is kind of America's place in the world has changed fundamentally over the last 25 years. And I'm not here to say that America's in decline. I'm not prepared to make that argument. But what I am prepared to say is that America's share of world power has diminished somewhat, and our ability to shape outcomes around the world has also changed. Increasingly, we face states like Turkey that on a Monday and Tuesday are supporting US interests and are a strong US ally. And on a Wednesday and Thursday are actively countering US interests. And I guess you could call them swing states. It's not Michigan and Pennsylvania, but it's swing countries. And these countries are very hard to work with because obviously you have certain interests in establishing a positive relationship with Turkey and trying to find a way forward, but also you have to acknowledge what Erdogan in this case is doing to undermine US interests across the entire region. And so the United States finds itself in this predicament where increasingly it is hard to shape the outcomes, policy outcomes, and behavior of other nation states. It is different than it was 25 years ago. Not that we could wave a magic wand and make everybody in the world do what we wanted, but our sets of relationships, even with a country like Germany, that's really grown up over the years and now has national interests and wants to reassert itself, at least sheepishly, on the world stage, than what we faced many, many years ago. So that's the United States. Okay, so the question for all of you this morning is fundamentally, does any of this matter? Does it matter? Does it matter that Washington and Brussels and London and Paris and Berlin are distracted? Does it matter that the American public is not as interested in taking on multi-year military interventions on the scale of Iraq or Afghanistan? Should we let someone else pick up the tab? We have resource constraints at home. Should we let other countries lead and find their way through these regional and global crises? There are a lot of questions out on the table. Should we be the world's policeman? It's a question that we hear frequently by our fellow citizens all around the country. And maybe, just maybe, that beautiful rules-based order, the liberal order, that we've spent 70 years constructing, and the alphabet soup of institutions that go with it, the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the European Union, NATO, the UN, maybe all of that isn't our normal state. Maybe we needed that system, and it played and served a role for the last 70 years or so, but it's time to think about a new model. Well, my answer on all of that, and I'd be interested in the Q&A for your views on this, is that it does matter, that it matters a great deal. I will acknowledge that those institutions that I just rattled off, NATO and the OSCE and the UN and the EU, are not particularly well suited to deal with today's challenges, and were designed for a different era. But, and I will also acknowledge that we have real resource constraints and there are limits on US power. But I do believe that the US and our allies, that we collectively have some unique attributes that allow us to address global security challenges in ways that no other set of countries can do so. I think many of us have dynamic economies. There are some weak economies in Europe that are still struggling to recover, but broadly, in comparison to the rest of the world, I think we have fairly dynamic economies. We have a set of alliances on which we've relied for the past 70 years. And that have served us well. We have world-class militaries. Yes, Europe could spend more on defense, and we can get into that in the Q&A if you want to, but by and large, our most capable military partners still reside in Europe, hands down. We have the ability to build international coalitions, particularly the United States. When Ebola hit a few years ago, The country that everybody called was the United States. Build the coalition and we'll all show up, but the United States has to lead it. When ISIL arrived on the scene, the call that came in from around the world, the United States has to build the international coalition, 60-some countries that are going to go after ISIL. The United States has that ability to bring in its partners, the vast network of partners and allies in every region around the world to deal with global challenges. And the United States and its allies have a tremendous amount of soft power in promoting and protecting human rights and democracy, things that not necessarily other countries are willing to do. So I guess the question is, if we're not willing to serve as the world's policeman, and that term I have trouble with, I don't mean let's go intervene in Iraq and stay there for another 10 years, but if we're not willing to at least do some community policing or walking the beat, which is my way of saying you have to be present and engaged in the world, then I think you run the risk of allowing a country like China or Russia to set the norms and the outcomes and the rules at the end of the day. Instead, I think the United States should work with its allies to uphold the rules-based order, however imperfect it might be, so that we can set the shared norms and values and outcomes in ways that other countries cannot. I do believe that those that are arguing for retrenchment right now fundamentally overestimate the costs of engagement in the world and underestimate the benefits of engagement in the world. And we can talk more about that later if you'd like. So lastly, the question is, well, the conclusion is we have a lot of work to do, we and our European allies. And so what does that wish list look like? If I had a magic wand and I could make some minor adjustments or major adjustments to the transatlantic relationship at this moment. Well, first and foremost, I think we have to see the return of U.S. leadership in the world, which frankly I'm not seeing at all right now and worries me a great deal. We are headed in the opposite direction. The State Department is a shadow of its former self, and the White House has very conflicted views and signals it's sending to the rest of the world about America's willingness and capacity to lead, and I think that has to change. Secondly, I think Europe and the United States, however distracted and consumed they may be by their own crises, they have to showcase transatlantic unity and resolve in the face of all of the threats that they're facing right now. If we sit and bicker over this Russia sanctions bill, and really get into a heated debate about it and find ourselves publicly bickering and insulting each other across the Atlantic, particularly between the German government and the US government, I think that just plays right into Putin's hands, where he continues to seize on any opportunities he can find to divide the transatlantic partners, because the strongest card we have to play is when we are united. And our position on what he did on Crimea and the sanctions we put forward have been a critical part of our messaging and policy towards that annexation of Crimea and the ongoing activities that Russia is undertaking in eastern Ukraine. I also think the transatlantic partners, working with other allies, the Japanese, the Koreans, Australians, many others, need to think about ways in which we can make that old, creaky, rusty, rules-based order more inclusive. It is fair for China to come to the table and say, we weren't present at the creation. We are someone that is now ever present on the world stage. We want to play a role, albeit not always a constructive one in my mind, but they have a legitimate concern to come forward and say, look, all of this was constructed in a completely different era. Can we think about ways in which we can either construct new entities that are inclusive, Or can we adjust some of the existing structures to make reforms that would make them more inclusive going forward? The challenge there is ensuring that we don't compromise our value set. And that's the fundamental challenge in trying to integrate some of these new powers into the system that we primarily created with our European allies after World War II. The other thing I would mention is the importance of getting the transatlantic trade relationship back on track. Remember that sleepy little trade agreement I mentioned at the opening, TTIP? That has failed and died. TTIP is no longer with us. We've issued last rites, not just because of the fact that President Trump came into office basically promising never to sign off on any global trade agreements of that nature, starting with TPP, but it also includes TTIP. But because even in the Obama administration, we were having real challenges finding common ground with our European allies on a number of issues, chlorinated chickens, the list goes on and on. But I think the EU-US trade relationship, which is the biggest in the world, has to continue to be the engine that drives global standards. And if we fail to do that, then other countries will come to the fore and they'll be the ones setting the norms and setting the values and standards. And so I hope that someone in the Trump administration or a group of individuals or the Germans, I know that have tried to make this case very aggressively, come to the president and persuade the president to reinvest in some sort of relationship going forward that's between Brussels and Washington, that we can build off the existing agreements and strengthen that trade relationship. Also, in the light of our economic relationship, I think Europeans and Americans are not yet talking about what we're going to do about this post-manufacturing world that we find ourselves dipping our toe in, and soon we're going to be up to our neck in. We are just at the tip of the iceberg with automation, with artificial intelligence, with robotics. The changes that are coming are going to come fast, and the transatlantic partners are not talking enough about the future of our economic relationship and what solution sets we're going to put forward when, say, truck driving just stops being a career because it's all automated. We have to start having a conversation with our European allies about this, and we are not even beginning that conversation. Lastly, I would say Europe, as it grapples with Brexit, also has an opportunity. Now that the UK is leaving the European Union, the UK was the one that was also often resisting efforts to turn Europe into a multi-speed Europe, where certain groups of countries could move forward. The Franco-German engine, which I hope they'll put the keys in after the German election, has the prospect of developing new initiatives both in the sphere of economic and foreign policies that could really take the EU forward in a very constructive way. And I would hope that without the UK, the EU is able to make some structural adjustments and allow those types of initiatives to move forward. So I see I'm slowly running out of time here, and I do want to hear your questions. But I guess in closing, I just say that it's a tall order in terms of what Europe and the United States need to be doing right now. And I'll also acknowledge that this relationship is definitely imperfect. It's difficult. It makes us cringe sometimes. We get frustrated with Europe. Europe gets frustrated with us. But the reality is that whenever either one of us is facing a challenge, whether it's the outbreak of Ebola or climate change or Iran's nuclear ambitions or a resurgent Russia or a resurgent China, whatever it might be, the best, most capable partnership to date that we can still rely on is that transatlantic relationship. And the first thing that happens in the Situation Room when you're facing a crisis, I've seen it many times, is a hand goes up and says, who's calling London, who's calling Brussels, who's calling Paris, who's calling Berlin? We get frustrated, again, could be better in lots of regards, but no partnership in the world, no group of allies can match the capacity of these two partners ability to act. And for that reason, I will continue to commit myself to the transatlantic relationship, and I hope you will too. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Julie. I don't know about you guys, but I'm starting a draft Julie Smith for President of the United States. We're going to have a break now. The cookies and the refreshments are outside as usual, and we will convene in a half hour, and that means 10:20. 10:21 exactly, right, Pete? Okay, let's go. Be back at 10:20, and please bring your questions up here. Thank you very much. Great. Okay, is everyone ready? We have about 100 questions here, and I thought that we would, go through them, and they're broken down mainly into Brexit questions, the future of the European Union, Russia and its role, and all the rest. And so, with all these questions here, I thought maybe we'd break around 2 o'clock for lunch, and then come back. At any rate. There are a couple of questions from our friends in Vermont, which I'll get to in a minute to give them first dibs, so to speak. But I wanted to throw out a question that one of the questioners posed in a long screed, which I'll try to summarize like this. A number of people, thoughtful people like you in Washington, have complained that if the Clinton administration had not enlarged NATO and did not agree to put anti-aircraft missiles into Poland and conducted military exercises, NATO exercises on the border of Russia in the Baltics in the early 90s or mid-90s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. If that all did not happen, it would have not necessarily have provoked Putin. And he was so incensed about that he is trying to pay back since. So the argument was, if those events had not happened, maybe Putin would be less aggressive. What do you feel about that?
Well, this is a debate that we've been having in Washington for several years. It ebbs and flows at different points in history. It was alive and well in a very active debate as we were going through enlargement. And it has resurfaced at every round. And it has become particularly acute as Putin has returned to power and annexed other countries' territory and has himself become more aggressive. He has a long list of grievances against the West and the behavior of countries. Most notably, it starts with the United States, but also a long list of grievances against European countries. And his argument is certainly exactly that if the West had not decided to enlarge the NATO alliance, that in fact we wouldn't be in this predicament. And Russia's relationship with the West would be more benign. And we wouldn't be in a situation where tensions are escalating. I am willing to hear him out on that, and I have heard many Americans talk about it. Europeans and Russians make that case over the years. I do believe, though, when we talk about that period in history, that one finds a little bit of revisionist history in that debate as well. I think originally, when we were debating the pros and cons of enlarging the NATO alliance, there was this theoretical future for Russia that had a vision of Russia moving ever closer to Western institutions, including the European Union. And that vision was not coming necessarily just from our side of the story, from Europe or from the United States, but that vision was being put forth at the time by some Russians, not all Russians, but some Russians were also interested in investigating the prospect of having Russia align itself and move ever closer to some of these institutions. And Russia was very interested, for example, in sending a permanent representative and having an ambassador at NATO headquarters, which it continues to have today. That was not something that we forced them to do. And we have had countless conversations over the years about ways in which Russia could work more closely, not just with NATO, but with the European Union, and it begged us just in recent years to join the WTO. And so we have had mixed signals from Russia about its interests in moving closer and working more closely with these institutions. And to be entirely honest, we have had mixed signals from the West, from Europe and the United States about what our intentions were. I think most of the people I've talked to that were in government in the Clinton administration at the time would argue that they felt that the right thing to do, the moral thing to do, and given that snapshot of history in the 90s after the Cold War ended, was to allow countries to make their own determination and have the freedom to choose the alliances that they wanted to join and institutions that they wanted to become a member of. And it so happened to turn out that these countries were very interested, for obvious reasons, particularly in joining the NATO alliance for security reasons, and also eventually joining the European Union. And the fact of the matter is that membership, the prospect of membership in these institutions, actually created real change in the countries in Central and Eastern Europe and served as a very useful carrot to get these countries to make democratic reforms and the changes that were necessary that would enable them to join those institutions. And we went through this debate again, by the way. We just added Montenegro to the NATO alliance at the last summit, so we're up to 29 members of the alliance. And so it's a debate we'll keep having. I would recommend to all of you, if you're interested in this subject, Michael O'Hanlon, who is the Director of Research at the Brookings Institution, just came out with a new book. It's called Beyond NATO, and he is making the case that we should close the door to enlargement, stop poking the Russian bear, and offer some sort of deal to the Russians where we create a neutral zone for countries like Ukraine and Georgia, Sweden and Finland, all sorts of other countries, Armenia, Serbia, Bosnia, where Russia would disengage in exchange for our promises not to enlarge. And this is creating, as you can imagine, a very feisty debate all across Washington again. And so if you're interested in sinking your teeth into this, I'm not sold on the idea. First of all, I don't think Ukraine and Georgia would go for it. I also wouldn't trust the Russians to actually leave Ukraine or Georgia. So I think I would take a kind of a distrust but verify approach on that front. Anyways, this is all a long way of saying that this debate will be with us for quite some time. I am not sold on the idea that we would be in an entirely different place. I think Putin is also trying to reassert Russia, wants to return Russia to its superpower status. One of the ways he can distract his own public from economic concerns and bad news at home is by having an adversary abroad, and that serves him very well.
A follow-up on that, on the economic point. I've always felt that the vulnerability of Russia was its economy and its dependence on an energy economy. With the declining price in oil, how long can Russia continue to carry on like this if its economy is in decline, number one? And second of all, and this relates to an interview you had on NPR on Tuesday, what was the purpose of Pence's visit to Georgia, Montenegro, and I think one of the Baltic states last week?
So I'll take Pence first. So the vice president has, much like Biden, by the way, has taken a very strong interest in working closely with countries like Ukraine and Georgia. And personally, I was thrilled to see him go to the Baltic states and meet with all three of the Baltic leaders in Estonia. I was glad that he also made a stop in Georgia and particularly Montenegro in light of what Russia had recently done in Montenegro to try and destabilize the government there. The message is pretty simple. The message is one of reassurance that the United States remains committed to the security of these countries, and that he decided, and this administration has decided, to state that the door to NATO enlargement remains open, made no promises about when that could possibly happen for Georgia, but wanted to be somewhat encouraging. And for Montenegro, that we care a great deal about what Russia's doing in small states like Montenegro, and that we're glad to have them be part of the NATO alliance. The problem with that trip, however, was that increasingly I find in engaging some of the folks in those countries, you come across a considerable amount of skepticism about whether or not what Trump feels matches what Pence is saying. That's the reality of it. And they base that on the fact that Pence came to the Munich Security Conference, which is a big transatlantic conference that's held every year in Munich. He was there this February saying the same things. And a few months later, Trump is standing in front of the new NATO headquarters and fails to kind of reassure our allies that the U.S. remains committed to Article 5. And so that experience has left a considerable amount of uncertainty among our allies. Granted, he said it later, but it was kind of a day late, dollar short. Okay, Russia. On the economy, I mean, that's the $64,000 question. By any indicator, if you look at the value of the ruble, or you look at capital flight, or you look at foreign investment, direct investment, and whatever it is, growth, it's all bad. And the price of oil obviously has had a dramatic impact, but so have sanctions over the years, because they're not getting the technology they need to access the energy resources that they have. So the question is, how long can Putin hang on? And we just don't know. I mean, on the one hand, we don't want to see the Russian economy collapse. That would be horrible. But we also don't want to create a generation of Russians that hate the United States either. And but we do want to put some pressure on Putin and make sure that there are consequences, that he feels consequences for his actions. So I mean, this is the question you debate in government over and over again, and I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, there are a ton of questions here on Brexit, and I want to get to them quickly. But first, I would like to, there are two questions from our friends at the University of Vermont, and I'll ask one of those. Are we seeing the rise of dictatorships here and in Europe?
You guys, yeah. I do think that we've seen a curious interest on the part of our president in authoritarian leaders, if I can say that diplomatically. President Trump has expressed some admiration for Putin's leadership style. We've heard that a couple of times. We've had an interesting offer by Trump to Duterte in the Philippines to come visit, which I find also to be a little troubling. And of course, Sisi in Egypt was welcomed into the Oval Office fairly early in the Trump administration's tenure. And yet, again, we have Trump standing at NATO headquarters refusing to reaffirm America's commitment to Article 5 of the NATO treaty. So I am disturbed by some of that, and wonder what is it about those leaders, and of course we had the sword dance in Saudi Arabia. We'll all remember that footage for some time. What is it about those leaders that the president admires so much? Why is he drawn to that type of leadership and those types of governments? And that worries me a great deal. And I guess I would feel better if it was paired with a doubling down on our commitments to our longstanding allies, but I haven't seen that. In Europe, I do feel like, again, and I talked about this earlier, we have some very troubling trends in countries like Hungary, where Orban does kind of keep me awake at night, or the Law and Justice Party in Poland and some of their efforts, again, to exert political control over the judiciary, and influence. So I don't think I'm ready to call anybody a dictator, but there are some trend lines that, in my mind, are not going in the right direction.
Thank you. Okay, let's go to Brexit now. Is there a way to stop Brexit?
Brexit for 400. This is like Jeopardy or something. I'll take Brexit for 200. You're reassessing. I see now. You don't.
I'll give you another one.
I'm happy to take Brexit for 200
okay.
or 400. Yeah.
What about Ireland and Scotland? Are they going to be damaged in any way, shape, or form? Are they going to join the exit or stay where they are? Do you have any predictions?
Another $64,000 question I wish I had the answer to. I mean, Scotland did have a referendum, you'll remember, in staying in, and I think if I remember correctly, in fact, I think I wrote it down so I'd remember, it ended up being, drumroll please, 55 to 45 not to split with the UK. That was in 2014. They've talked about having another referendum, and I don't know if that will actually move forward or not, but certainly there's unhappiness there in Scotland about the results of the Brexit referendum, and we've seen similar rumblings in Ireland. In fact, I think it was the head, he was meeting with, who was he meeting with? Merkel? I'm trying to remember who met with whom. Anyways, there were just remarks this week of the Irish saying, we hope Brexit actually doesn't come to pass. We hope they get to the end of this process and they realize that it's not going to be the sweetness and light that many people believe it will be, and that we can kind of breathe a sigh of relief and go back to the way it was. I don't know if that will happen. We may end up, I think, with a softer exit that will actually lead towards the UK leaving the EU. But what we do hear is that Ireland and Scotland are not 100% on board with this, and it remains to be seen what would happen if there were movements for them to drift away from Britain. I have such a hard time getting there in my head, but certainly people have proposed that idea.
Tony Blair recently suggested that the EU may move away from the principle of freedom of movement of people. Could this be a path for the weakened UK government to cancel Brexit and remain in the EU? The whole freedom of people, movement of people?
Yeah, so the freedom of movement is one of the biggest issues up for debate right now, and one of the biggest issues under negotiation with Brussels, with a lot of open-ended questions about what happens to the many European citizens that are living and working in the in the UK, and frankly doing jobs that a lot of ordinary folks in the UK don't want to do. They have a tremendous reliance on other Europeans in their workforce in multiple aspects, in science and engineering, but also running hotels and all sorts of stuff. The ever famous Polish plumber you've no doubt heard about. Obviously, if the EU radically changed its position and the Schengen Agreement, which allows for free movement, were to collapse, that would certainly throw a wrench in the negotiations. But I don't see the EU doing that, despite Tony Blair suggesting it. And B, I don't know if it would be enough to fundamentally halt the process.
Is there any evidence of Russian attempts to influence the Brexit vote that you're aware of?
It's interesting. I haven't seen much work done on that. There have been a few folks that have suggested that maybe it was fanning the flames on the Leave side a little bit, but it's not something that I'd be comfortable talking about because what I have tracked very closely is what it did in the French election in supporting Le Pen. Russian banks gave her a significant amount of resources. I think a third of her campaign budget came from Russian banks. By the way, that's legal in France. There's no problem doing that. She didn't do anything wrong by accepting Russian money. And she said, look, if the French banks won't give it to me, then I'll go elsewhere. And according to their system, that's perfectly fine. So that's one thing. But also they did hack Macron's emails and release them in an effort to be very disruptive to his campaign in the final days before the election. The good news is France was at the ready and prepared for that. They knew that Marine Le Pen had very close ties to Moscow and was the preferred candidate by many in Russia. And so they had really kind of cracked down on their cyber defenses. They had broader conversations about public resilience. I just think they were better prepared, and it didn't have the impact, I think, that Russia anticipated. Similarly, the Germans are anticipating more interference in their election as we march towards September. The Bundestag was hacked a couple of years ago, also by the Russians. They've had several incidents, so including pretty aggressive disinformation campaigns that were really horrible. Some fake news stories about a young woman that actually had been sexually assaulted by refugees turned out to be entirely false, but stirred a very heated debate about refugees at a time when they were pouring into Germany. And that was very effective use of disinformation on the part of the Russians. So the Germans, too, are watching this. But for Brexit, yeah, I'd have to look at that a little. I have not seen much that indicates that they really got in under the hood and played a role there.
Follow up on that one. For a long while, Merkel was the only one that really could talk to Putin, not only because he spoke fluent German, but also because they seemed to have had a pretty good relationship with each other, which Obama used to some extent. But has that changed at all recently as a result of what has happened on the United States elections and the revelations about the Trump involvement or the Trump family involvement? Has that changed in any way?
No, I mean, Merkel does have a very unique relationship with Putin, and it can be very tense at times, and he can be very nasty towards her. You may remember the story. She has a fear of dogs, and he brought in these huge... He met with her in Moscow and surrounded her with giant dogs, which is lovely.
Rottweilers, no doubt.
Yeah, that was just... so kind of him to do that. So there is that kind of stuff. But on the other hand, she speaks Russian, he speaks German. Germany and Russia have had a very unique relationship that differs from many of the other countries in Europe. In many ways, many German leaders have had close relationships with other Russian leaders. They've had a very close energy relationship. Of course, they're talking now about Nord Stream 2. And how they can make progress on that. And so I do think it's a channel on which the United States will continue to rely. We all have pretty contentious relationships with him in terms of Europe and the United States, but that Merkel pragmatism has really served everyone quite well. She's very direct, she's very blunt, no nonsense, wants to get to the bottom line. I think he trusts her even when he doesn't like her. It works. It works in many ways better, certainly far better than what Cameron had or Hollande in France or virtually any other European leader.
Or
So I think
even
it'll-
Obama for that
And
matter.
even Obama,
Yeah,
for
yeah,
sure.
yeah,
Oh, yeah,
yeah.
the hands down, yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think, I mean, the problem now is, of course, Trump and Merkel are not the best of friends, and I would hope that increasingly he would understand, to the extent that he wants to, like every U.S. president, warm relations with the Russians and have a Russian reset 3.0, because we saw one in the Bush administration, we saw one in the Obama administration, we may very well see an attempt in this administration, although that's looking less likely now that he signed the sanctions bill. But nonetheless, I would hope that he would understand that she will be key in advancing that agenda if he's serious about it.
Yeah. One aside, I'm always curious about the Trump handshakes, and I've noticed that he and Putin have a very quick handshake, very, very quick. It's not one of these hold forever things. But the only two leaders that I've seen that are able to trump Trump are Macron and and my friend north of the border, the Canadian Prime Minister. Especially when he put his left hand on Trump's shoulder to hold him away. Great shot.
Yeah, there's a lot of studying that went into that. I think Macron, it's funny, I thought, well, maybe we're making too much out of this handshake when they first met, and then Macron went out and stood up and said, no, that I had a plan. That was what I wanted to do. I wanted to have an effective handshake with him, so yeah.
There were a number of questions about, would you like to have a drink, incidentally?
I would like to have a
whiskey
drink, but
or,
there's nothing up here. No, anyway. No, I'm fine, thank you. That'll come later. Yeah.
You want some tea? You want some tea?
I'm good, good, thank you.
Good. In your opinion, a number of questions about the economic implications of Brexit. And what they really come down to is the strength. You have to project the strength of the UK economy if you have a hard landing out of Brexit. And this other question related to this is, what impact would you project for the trade relationships between the United States and the UK if the UK is out or there is a hard landing, so to speak?
Well, I'll have to admit that I'm a little bit of a skeptic here. Those of us in Washington have been greeted almost weekly with some UK official. The British embassy has just been flooding the zone, so to speak. We get visitors all the time from the defense secretary to the treasury, just all over the place, commerce, whatever it is. And they all come with one message. Britain will be stronger and more active and a better partner to the United States post-Brexit. And you can count on that. Economically, in the defense relationship, diplomatically, we're going to be bigger, we're going to be bolder, we're going to be more active, we're going to free ourselves from the chains of the EU bureaucracy. And we envision ourselves taking a greater role on the world stage. We're talking about sending aircraft carriers, into the South China Sea. And all of that sounds pretty good to many of us. We're like, oh, love to see you do more. But most of us kind of let them walk away and say, my goodness, that's never going to happen. Because I just think there's no question that there's going to be some budgetary consequences of this that they're not even thinking about. I just read a story the other day that said just constructing the customs centers where people are going to be coming, the trucks in and out of the UK and the tunnel and the backlog and clearing everything. That alone could be upwards of £1 billion. They're just talking about infrastructure challenges associated with this that I think they're just beginning to wrap their head around. So right now,
let's say from a defense perspective, Britain's doing and saying all the right things. They're making new investments. They have big plans to acquire the F-35. They're talking about new aircraft carriers and all the rest. And to have a European ally talk about Asia is remarkable. It's just no one in the Pentagon right now, I think, thinks that that's actually going to come to pass. That if there's a real pinch in the wake of Brexit, the first place they're going to look is foreign and defense policy. It's an easy place to cut. And certainly with the mood of the British public, they want investments in their own healthcare and education and jobs. They don't care. Some guy that's waiting 6 months for an MRI doesn't want to see an aircraft carrier in the South China Sea. That's just not relevant, you know? And so how British politicians are going to make the case for this bolder vision of UK foreign policy, I don't know how they're going to get there. And the trade relationship with the United States, I mean, obviously Trump is aggressively pursuing that. And Liam Fox was over recently. We've had a lot of visitors to start these confidence-building measures and begin a conversation about what our trade relationship's going to look like going forward. But not a lot can happen or not a lot can be clarified until they finish the process of Brexit. And so I think anybody that can tell you what exactly our trade relationship's going to look like or what the UK is going to look like when this is all said and done, say 5 years from now, is probably selling you, a bill of goods, because it's just not, right now it's very hard to predict what the outcome is going to be. And each week another shoe drops in terms of, oh wow, we didn't think about this consequence of it. Because no country has ever gone through such an exit, it's just hard to fathom what this is all going to look like.
Yeah, there are a number of questions asking, following up on that, whether the United States should intervene in some way, covertly or overtly, to try to influence the process to either redo the whole Brexit thing or influence the outcome. This wasn't asked, but my response to that would be, even a realistic outside of the Defense Department and the current Defense Department? This is certainly not coming out of the State Department. Do you have any views about that?
Well, I actually, just going back a little bit, I found it really interesting that Obama, the self-declared Pacific president, who wasn't always sold, I think, on the utility of the transatlantic relationship, certainly didn't feel like the center of U.S. foreign policy was still in Europe, was looking more to Asia and the Middle East, that at the end of his tenure made the most passionate plea for the UK to stay in the European Union, more so than any other European leader. Merkel didn't go to London to make the case for the Brits to stay in the EU. Obama did. And I found that interesting. And then the question was, well, once they voted, should the United States be weighing in any way? And I think many of us on the left and the right concluded that's not particularly helpful. And in fact, when I was working on the Clinton campaign, we had a number of exchanges with folks in Brussels that came to tell us, you're welcome to your opinion, but please keep it to yourself if you were to win the election. And sadly, that did not come to pass. Anyways, I found it interesting that we were being signaled from our friends in Brussels that the U.S. should essentially stay out of it. What's happened now, though, is that we have a president that's ultimately being tutored on EU matters by a guy by the name of Nigel Farage, who is a very outspoken EU skeptic, to say the least. And the fact that he's had so many interactions with Trump, and we know where Steve Bannon stands on the European Union and others, I just worry about Trump actually taking he's already said some very negative things about the European Union and how they're handling Brexit. So I fear that we could kind of put our foot in it in a way that would be unhelpful.
Yes. Let's see here. Should this is sort of not directly Brexit, but there are two questions about whether it would serve anyone's interest to try to encourage Russian membership in the European Union.
Whether it would be in anyone's interest?
Yeah.
I I'm speechless. It's so hard to fathom what that would look like. I mean, first of all, I don't think the European Union could take anybody in right now. I mean, there's definitely not the Russians. I don't think they would be interested. No one would be interested. I mean, the EU is fundamentally facing an existential crisis about the future of the European project. And until it navigates this chapter, this Brexit chapter, I think there are so many open-ended questions about the future of the existing structures that they are unable to fathom at this point any additional rounds of enlargement or expansion.
Yeah, I think you've just answered this question. We're going into Europe now rather than Brexit, and that the question has to do how can Europe sustain its strength and vision if it continues to expand to 25 or more countries, which I think you've just answered.
Yeah, I mean, there's always this debate about, by expanding, are these institutions ultimately weakening themselves, weakening their resolve, particularly for institutions like the NATO alliance that operate by consensus. It's no question it's harder to reach consensus among 29 countries than it was with the original 12. But at the same time, I'm not prepared to argue that everyone that we've added to the NATO alliance is a security consumer. Many of them have actually turned out to be security providers in very helpful ways and have been active in NATO missions. And I think the same holds true for the European Union. Certainly they too are grappling now with an organization that is very large and very bureaucratic and needs desperately structural reform. But I think many people do find value in folding in these countries with the hope that it makes Europe collectively stronger.
Related to that is a specific one about Italy. What strategies can the EU bring to help alleviate Italy's migration crisis? You mentioned it in your talk, the 90,000 coming in. Is there anything the EU can do to help Italy deal with that?
Yeah, it can do a couple of things. The European Union can provide additional resources for the countries that are sending refugees to Europe, and it has a pretty extensive development assistance program that has been able to try and assist countries like Libya or Tunisia, for that matter, or all sorts of countries throughout Africa and the Middle East that need assistance to try and address some of the socioeconomic factors that are triggering people to leave. The EU could play a stronger role. It's not playing much of a role right now in trying to broker some sort of political settlement in Syria, which would have an impact. It could enhance its presence in the Mediterranean. Militarily, it has a presence in the Mediterranean that's designed to pick up some of the refugees and protect them that are often floating in a lifeboat somewhere in the middle of the Mediterranean. And then for Italy itself, it can put pressure on other EU member states to relocate some of the refugees that are coming in. The European Union just issued a report, I think it was 2 months ago, that literally named and shamed countries in the European Union that were doing a lot to relocate refugees and those that were doing absolutely nothing, and directly called out those countries that were doing nothing and said that has to change. So relocation and then direct resources for Italy to assist with the programs that they're providing, the support that they're providing to the refugees that are there.
Which countries are doing nothing?
The ones that probably win the biggest prize for literally being at ground zero are Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And the ones that get the greatest praise, although they're often attacked by their neighbors for being too open-minded about it because they've kind of unilaterally tipped the balance. In Europe as Germany #1 and Sweden #2.
Huh. Yeah. In your talk, you when we were talking about the future of the West, you mentioned the corrosive effects of recent developments over the last 25 years on institutions and norms that are essential for democracies to thrive and to continue. When you look at this challenge, and you think back about efforts by the United States to promote democracy, what key elements of democracy do you think are on the priority list? Do you have any?
What key elements of democracy
promotion? Is it rule of law?
Yeah.
Is it checks and balances? Is it institutions or the courts? Or what are the kinds of things that you feel that can usefully be done in this environment to shore up democracy in this kind of challenging age?
Well, first of all, I find it tragic that we're having to talk about democracy promotion, both in terms of our own country on occasion, and whether or not the institutions are making the right mid-course corrections in our own society, but also whether or not Europe needs a little more work in the area of democracy promotion. I mean, that's not the vision we had when we launched into the process of enlargement in the European Union. And to see a country like Poland and Hungary, but some others, rolling back again some of the progress that they've made since the early 1990s is really a tragic tale. But there's work to do elsewhere. There's work to be done in Ukraine and other former Soviet states. This is really a better question for my husband who works on democracy promotion, but I'll try to channel my best impression of him. I think some of the aspects are it's rule of law, support for civil society, human rights, but it's also free press in many cases, particularly in Turkey, where Erdogan is locking up literally thousands of members of the media. In a very disturbing way in light of the attempted coup last year. Parliamentary reform, anti-corruption. I mean, the list is pretty long. I guess it's hard to make the priority list because depending on what country you're talking about, there's kind of a different emphasis. I mean, I am very worried about rule of law in Poland. I'm also worried about rule of law in Turkey, but also very worried about the press. Ukraine, it's anti-corruption is kind of top of the list, so it varies.
Okay, we have a number of different questions on a number of issues, and I'll throw out a few of them, and you can take them or leave them if you wish.
Speed round.
Is a first strike on North Korea being actively considered, and how likely is it?
I don't work for the government anymore. I'm not privy to those conversations. I don't know. I've heard quotes and rumblings and seen tweets that lead me to conclude that someone in the government is certainly looking at that. I think it's ridiculous. I mean, there's no military answer to this. But I also saw that they're talking about, I guess they already have sent a signal to the North Koreans that we're prepared to sit down and have a conversation about the conditions under which North Korea is going to have these types of capabilities and what the consequences will be if and when they try to sell them to other countries or actors, and then what would happen if they actually use them. And that's kind of the world we're living in now. I really think a negotiated settlement, not settlement, but a negotiation, a political negotiation is the only way forward. Some sort of dialogue. Diplomacy is the only path, not some sort of military strike.
Yeah, thanks. You worked under two different secretaries of defense, Bob Gates and Leon Panetta. I think the audience might be interested in your take on working for these two gentlemen.
Well, they're both terrific and incredibly different. And when you work in government, you learn to work under different principles. These two principles had two very different styles of working. Bob Gates is someone who would definitely say no amount of information is too much. So when I traveled with him overseas, often to NATO ministerials, for example, or NATO summits, we would give him briefing binders that were about 2.5 inches thick. And I would always think to myself, there's no way he's going to read all of this. And then the plane would land and we'd go into the meeting in Brussels or wherever, and he'd end up quoting something on page 79, you know, some ridiculously small little statistic that you had thrown in for good measure and you were hoping was correct. And he'd rattle it off in a meeting and you'd think, my God, I've got to spend more time working these briefing books. You know, he's reading everything, God help us. And Panetta was entirely different. He, like some people, has a preference to engage in a conversation, and he does much of his learning through oral briefings and has this like steel trap memory where he can just, as you're talking, is just filing it all away somewhere. And so we would conduct pretty in detail, very lengthy briefings for him in advance of trips, and by contrast, give him a much thinner briefing book that he may or may not have looked at, but always came in and did the exact same thing, would end up rattling off some detail, and you weren't sure he had picked up on it or had remembered it, and would just shock you with his ability to absorb information. And both of them were very effective. In different ways. I would just say on NATO defense spending, they had two very different approaches. I helped draft a speech that Bob Gates gave in Brussels in 2011. It was his last trip to Brussels to meet with NATO allies. And I don't know if you caught the headlines then, but it was this very caustic, brash, aggressive speech about the consequences of Europeans underinvesting in their defense budgets. And it really sent kind of a shockwave across Europe. It was very direct. And if you haven't seen that speech, you should look at it. It's very relevant for today. And it reminds us that we've been beating up on our European friends about this for some time. Panetta had a totally different approach. Panetta came into office and saw the speech, agree with, the points that were made, but I'm going to quietly behind closed doors, make this point to our European friends in more of a gentle way, and I'm not going to give big speeches on this. And so he brought all of the ministers in, and we would often talk to them about the need for change. The reality is that neither approach really worked at the end of the day. We didn't see big changes in European defense spending after the Gates speech or after Panetta had really tried to make this plea to European defense ministers. And in all honesty, what really got the Europeans to move the needle on European defense spending was when Putin took a bite out of Crimea, and I think that got their attention. And many of them at that point stopped the cuts that they were making to their defense budgets and started turning around and spending more. And that, paired with President Trump, who's been very direct in his messaging as well, has led to some change, some important change. I actually think you've no doubt seen the statistics that there are only a handful of countries out of the 29 members that meet the target of spending 2% of their GDP on defense. And I think it's 4 or 5 countries it changes. Sometimes France is in, sometimes France is out. In any case, it's too small of a number, but I think in the next couple of years, the way the trend lines are going right now, we're going to see more countries cross that threshold in the next probably 2 to 5 years, where we'll have a number of countries spending more.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. There are a couple of questions about Germany that are interesting. This one says, a year ago, I heard the leader of a far-right party in Nuremberg speak about his party's national aspirations. In the question and answer after the talk, he was asked about which world leader he admired most. Without hesitation, he responded, Putin and Trump. This relates to a second question. It says, what if Merkel were to lose the election, and therefore we have a different kind of Germany politically? Does that bother you at all? Is that a prospect that you think might materialize, or what do you have any reactions to that?
I'm a fan of Chancellor Merkel. I think she's done a pretty good job. She's been in office for 12 years. She's had highs and lows like any leader. Don't agree with her on every policy and every choice she's made, but I think she's been effective. And frankly, I think she's shown more courage in the face of some of the global challenges we've been talking about here today than almost any other leader in Europe over the last couple of years. In terms of the election, I mean, I think things are looking pretty good for her based on some of the elections we've had at the state level. But I do also see that the Alliance for Deutschland, the AfD, is a party that has gained some ground in recent years, and they do feed into some of those insecurities, identity politics, immigration concerns, socioeconomic grievances in unhelpful ways, and creates the us versus them narrative. And it wouldn't surprise me that someone at a rally like that would cite Putin and Trump. But I'm not at the point where I think that that party is going to have any significant impact. I mean, it will be a coalition, as it always is. Even if the SPD were to pull it off in partnership with some other parties, I don't lie awake at night thinking, Germany could just turn the other direction in ways that I thought that if Marine Le Pen won in France, I think that would have had a pretty devastating effect on the future of Europe.
Yes.
Germany is a different story.
Yeah.
It's not that we're facing the prospect of a Marine Le Pen type character. Now, the last thing I would want to do is leave you with the impression that some of these parties are going to go away. I mean, the National Front in France is still there.
Yes.
And if Macron doesn't succeed in meeting some of his very ambitious goals, and they're very ambitious, and they resemble what Hollande had when he came into office and didn't make much progress, then the National Front will have another lease on life, you know? And so we shouldn't, assume that because Macron won, or even if Merkel wins in Germany, we've got nothing to worry about. We have to address these, in many ways, legitimate grievances that some of our publics are expressing about the economic disparities and what's happened in the wake of globalization. So we can't just shrug our shoulders and say, oh, that was a blip. We've got through that. The Dutch got through their election. We don't have Geert Wilders now. That would be the worst outcome. The better outcome would be to say, how can we help some of these people that find appeal in some of these far-right parties?
Yes.
And what can we do to help them in very real ways?
We're coming back down to the end of this now, just a couple of more. Looking back on the Obama administration, was there a unanimity of view within the administration about European policy, or was there a constant tension between defense and state or these kinds of agencies? Were they operating on the same page, or from your perspective, or not?
Well, we had lots of fiery debates on all sorts of things. I mean, most notably Syria, which will forever haunt me in terms of the weekly meetings that I attended while I was at the White House, where many of us just felt incredibly troubled by the choices that we were facing and the lack of options that we had. And yeah, that's a whole nother chapter. On Europe, there were some debates. I guess the fiercest debate was when I was at the Pentagon, there's a real divide in the administration over the ever-famous pivot to Asia and what this would ultimately mean for our relationship with Europe. And you'll remember we decided to take 2 brigade combat teams that were in Afghanistan at the time and not return them to Europe. That we decided that instead of having 4 brigade combat teams present in Europe, we would go to 2. And we still have those 2 brigades there, although now we've added more posture after what happened in Crimea on a rotational basis. But I was definitely an outlier with a couple of my colleagues on arguing for those troops to remain in Europe. What happens when you start talking about force posture is that forces that are stationed in Texas or North Carolina or wherever have members of Congress that will fight for them.
Yes.
But the forces that exist in Europe or Italy or Korea don't necessarily have a champion.
Yeah.
And so they're kind of the first to take the cut, and we've seen that on multiple occasions. And particularly in light of the president's interest in pivoting to Asia and focusing more on the Pacific, which I fully appreciated the rationale for doing that. We felt that we would need less posture in Europe. Now, I tried to say, well, you never know, what might happen on the horizon.
Yeah.
And when you may need those forces either in the Middle East or elsewhere.
Yeah.
And they're very helpful to us in terms of maintaining training and exercising and close connective tissue and a close relationship with European forces. But we lost, and we took that posture out of Europe. I personally regret it.
Did Joe Biden get involved in that? Where did he come down?
Yeah. I wasn't working for him at the time, but there were long-standing kind of Europe advocates,
Yes.
I think, that saw the utility in keeping forces in Europe. I mean, there were debates up and down the chain. There were debates at lower levels and at higher levels. I mean, ultimately, I think the vice president appreciated what the priority was of the administration, and that was to turn our attention to Asia and get us out of the Middle East, which unfortunately still hasn't really come to pass. But yeah, that was probably one of the most contentious debates that we had in the administration.
Yeah. Okay, we've kept you for a long time. I mean, you've had a rough day getting to Hanover, New Hampshire, and and you didn't get much sleep last night. So let me bring this to a conclusion with a Julie Smith question. I don't know if you're going to accept my my offer to start a movement to get you to be president of the United States, but. She claims that she is an internationalist and not well schooled in domestic policy. I don't believe that for 1 minute. But at any rate, okay, looking to the future, here is Julie Smith. There's an administration that is looking to staff up. What would your choices be? Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, or ambassador to the court of St. James? Come on now, let's go.
That's not fair.
But it's true.
I would be.
Or write your memoirs.
Yeah, maybe that. No, I guess.
Where do you see? Where are you going?
I'm not going to answer that question. Let me just say one thing that bothers me about how people view Washington right now, and it comes a little bit back to your question. And that is, for people like myself and thousands of other people that have served on both sides of the aisle in countless administrations, there's this frustration that the rest of the country views Washington as a bunch of fat cats sitting around with their feet up on the desk, smoking cigars, or I don't know, drinking 3 martinis, I don't know what it is, wasting your time and wasting your taxpayer dollars. But the reality is that many of us go into public service with the best of intentions. We want to serve, and we go in trying to do the right thing. And that goes for a lot of people that are currently working in government, and even some people that have come into government, that they're there because they want to serve the American people. And I think when we are faced with the question of going back in, And now I'll speak very personally. You know, I know what it's like to serve in government, and I know the sacrifices that one makes when you go into government. And so if there were to be an administration in the future, I certainly have an interest in contributing in one way or another, in any way that someone deems appropriate at a higher level. But I also know, with 2 young children, that they pay the price for that. And what bothers me is that when I go home to Michigan and I meet with my relatives, they're like, oh, you Washingtonians, you know, wasting our time and not addressing our concerns, and aren't you lucky, you know, making the big bucks and I think, okay, you know, we're doing fairly well. I'm doing fairly well. I've had a lot of wonderful opportunities. I've been very fortunate. But I don't think you guys understand that how many times I had to say goodnight to my kids over the phone, and how much time I missed with my husband, and how my physical health deteriorated, traveling and working those hours. And that holds true for every single person that's working in the administration right now. And you may disagree with their policies, but trust me, they're working hard, and many of them are doing so at great sacrifice. And so each time you have this opportunity to go in, you have to ask yourself, do I want to do this? You know, ultimately, and it's a privilege and an honor, but it's a tough choice. And I think for us to portray it as anything other than that is unfair to the people that are making those choices and working those 16-hour days.
Well, great. That was a marvelous way to end this session, and I want to thank Julie for her service to the nation and for coming to Hanover. Thank you very much.